I guess I should introduce myself because only Katie really knows me. So my name is Alison. I work as the Children and Families Mission Leader in a place called Bishop Auckland. So we are in the far northeast. We're up in Durham Diocese. So we're about halfway between Durham and Barnard Castle, which you may have some inkling of where we are now, which maybe you wouldn't have done a couple of years ago. To give you a little bit of context, Bishop Auckland is it's a market town. It's ex-mining. It's generally speaking very deprived, although there are a few small pockets of more middle class. It is where the Bishop of Durham lives. So he lives in our parish. He's one of our parishioners. And we have lived here for 3.5 years now. So so my husband is the vicar, and when we were looking for posts for his first incumbency, the profile stood out. And one of the reasons that the profile here stood out is because we noticed on the statistics that there were 50 to 60 infant baptisms each year, but there were no children attending church. And we had 5 children of our own at that point. And we have done, over the years, we've done quite a lot of different children's ministry and worked in churches who have been willing to try all sorts of different things. So we've done Fresh Expressions, we've done Mission Shaped Church, and as well as a very standard middle of the road church with junior church groups. I hate that term, but we've done all sorts, and we really felt that God was calling us to Bishop. So we came, and very soon after I fell pregnant with baby number 6. So we do now have 6 children. Now, when we came, I was just the vicar's wife, and operated as such. Yeah, I know Katie's going to shake her head. You're never just the vicar's wife. So I did everything that I did to begin with. I did as a volunteer, and so to begin with, it was well, we thought it was going to be just our children, but people heard that this new vicar had some children and they were going to be there. So some people started bringing some children. And so to begin with, we were just in, mainly in one church. So in St Andrews. St Andrews is it's a very physically large church that has its Holy Communion every week. It's traditional liturgical worship. Typically it would have traditional hymns with organ, and it's just very middle of the road. It wouldn't describe itself as Catholic or evangelical. It's just very middle of the road. So when we went there, I decided that my children were never going to be able to sit through a service like that, and I was going to take them out. And that was where we were when we came here. But the room that I had to take the children out into was tiny. Like, when there were 10 children, our room was full and you could only sit. There was no space to move. Very tiny. And it was full. Like, almost instantly, we were full and we had no space to grow. So we spent some time just getting to know people and listening, and you have to spend some time getting to know a new area. You can probably guess from my accent, I do not come from the northeast, so this is a real culture shock for me being here, and so we needed to learn the culture and find out what people wanted, where their heart was, what God was doing, and so on. And so after we'd spent some time in the church, we held a vision day, and then out of that came the idea that is now Sunday gathering. So there is another church in our parish called St Anne's. It's in the marketplace, in the town centre, if you like. So it is, how to describe St Anne's. St Anne's is quite small. It's not a big church physically, but it is very well positioned. So it's in a position that is, a lot of people will be passing by, and there's a lot of things that happen literally on our doorstep. So for example, the food festival, which can attract, I think it's something crazy like 10,000 people a day for 2 days, is happening directly outside our church, and other festival type things as well. So St Anne's was, it was in not the greatest of states in terms of attendance. We had probably between 1 and 6 people attending on the Sunday morning for a traditional service at 8 o'clock. And anyway, long story short, we planted Sunday Gathering in the September when we'd been here nearly a year. So Sunday Gathering, when we planted it, we genuinely didn't know who would turn up the first week, apart from 2 other families who had older children, older teenagers. But we advertised and word was out and people came. And we'd made a deliberate decision that we wanted to do a more relaxed and contemporary service for Sunday Gathering because we wanted to offer some choice. So we absolutely value the traditional service that there is in St Andrews, but we wanted to offer something that was an alternative to that as well. So we fell into intergenerational worship without intending to begin with. So by that, what happened was we decided that we would do something that was all age to begin with. And we did that because we didn't have teams. There simply weren't people yet to take children out and do groups. But our thinking to begin with was that when we had enough children and enough adults, then of course what we could do then is we could have the adults stay in church and the children go out and do their groups and then come back in, because that was all we'd ever really known, apart from maybe a once a month all age worship. But we were a little bit surprised by what happened. So a couple of different things happened that meant that plans changed. The first was that the people who were coming along who were unchurched and not the more middle class Christians who came to have a look, they didn't want to leave their children in a group. They liked being with their children. It was going to church was a family event and they wanted to stay together as family, so they didn't want that to change. They liked coming in that sort of setting. We also had quite a lot of them come. So before lockdown, we were at a point where we had roughly 25 children and 50 adults. No, sorry, 25 adults. So 25 and 25. Problem is, if you then decide that you're going to send your children out with some adults, we were going to have sent more people out than were staying in the service, which is brilliant and absolutely fantastic problem to have. But then we needed to start thinking, well, you know, what is God doing here? What are we doing? What is this all about? Why is this happening? Why is this popular? What is going on here? And so we came across intergenerational worship. So I'd read about it at times, as you do. You know, when you read it, so particularly this book here, so Sticky Faith, I'd read that book years ago, and there's some really great stuff in there about why intergenerational relationships are incredibly important. And so if you haven't read it, then I would say that the headliner from that book is that they're looking at the phenomenon of children who do grow up in the church and then who stop attending, why that is and what can help them to keep on attending and to have sticky faith. And the researchers were asked for, if there was a silver bullet, what would it be? And they said, well, honestly, there isn't one particular thing that we would say, do this and it's all going to be okay. But if we were pressed and had to say something, then Intergenerational Church would be it. And they have got, so there's some really great stuff in there about why intergenerational relationships are important, how they support children, particularly through teenage years and into young adulthood. And we know, looking at our statistics, as so particularly in the Church of England, we have about a 50% attrition rate. So children who are growing up in the church, only about 50% of them end up being church-going adults. And so that came through as a way to try and help that, so that we were losing less. And the reason that they came out with that was the idea that, so, you know, when you have amazing kids groups, and there are absolutely phenomenal kids groups out there. My children have been to unbelievable kids work, and they come back and they're fired up and this is amazing. And I love it as a parent. I think, yes, this is great. My children are on fire for God and they've learned this and they've experienced this. And I absolutely love that. And I haven't had to be responsible for it. And I haven't had to worry about anything at all. But of course, then there is always some disconnect if that isn't happening in a family situation. But the main problem that they found with the sticky faith research was that when that stops, so at some point you are no longer in youth ministry or even young adult ministry, like however far you take it, you get to a point where you just are in church, in your standard adult church, and it looks incredibly different to what you've been attending. So if you've gone to something, and in their words, almost too bespoke, even too good, as it were, then when that isn't there anymore, then it can be really difficult. And the time when that often happens to be a problem is when people start attending university. And they have this lovely quote in the book that says that the kids who are going to university are young people who are going off to university. They're looking for a church and they're finding it really hard to find a church, because what they're really looking for is youth group. And of course, church doesn't look like youth group. And so they can't find something that they feel at home in and something that suits them. And so then they don't go, and then they've drifted away. So having read that and heard about that, I didn't want that to happen with our children. Particularly thinking about my children, if I'm honest, to begin with, that's where I started, and I have 6 children. I don't only want 3 of them to still be attending church when they're adults. I would love it if all 6 of them are. So we started looking a bit more into intergenerational church and working out what it was that we were doing and how we were doing it. So a few things happened that supported us at that time. About this time 1 year ago, an incredibly helpful thing happened. So COVID happened, obviously, and that meant that the Intergenerate Australia conference went online. So I joined via Zoom, and I think that we started at like 11 o'clock at night because they were in Australia, and went through the night. But there was some brilliant stuff that I picked up there. And then this chap called Dave Senos, who you may have heard of, he came to Durham Diocese, and he gave a bit of a talk about intergenerational church for the clergy and any other interested people. So at that point we felt like, oh, we feel like we're doing intergenerational church, but we'll go and we'll listen. And we sat at the back, and I thought, you know what, we're not doing intergenerational church, we're doing multi-generational church, and we need to learn, because this isn't going to work otherwise. We're not going to get the benefits of intergenerational church unless it actually is intergenerational. So I think at this point, the most helpful thing I can do, I'm going to bring up on my screen the definition of intergenerational ministry as is set out on the Intergenerate Australia website. So it comes from this book. But it says intergenerational ministry occurs when a congregation intentionally combines the generations together in mutual serving, sharing, or learning within the core activities of the church in order to live out being the body of Christ to each other and the greater community. So there's a couple of things in there that I think are really important. One of them, the first one that I pick up is intentionality. And then the next thing is mutuality. So we, as I said, fell into intergenerational church. We had not been intentionally intergenerational. And we realized that that needed to change. And we needed to work out that if we were going to call ourselves intergenerational, then we needed to think about what that really meant, how we did that, and to be intentional in doing so, and what that looked like. And then mutuality as well. So yeah, it's very easy to give children or adults bit parts in a service. It's a very different thing when you are intergenerational. So what do I mean by that? Well, I could, for example, have written a prayer, and I could ask my 8-year-old, would you read this prayer out for mummy at the prayer slot today? And she'll be, yes. And she will do that for me, and she will do it brilliantly. But is that her prayer? It's not, is it? Is that really her leading a prayer? Is it a prayer from her heart? It's just not. And so we have been on quite the learning journey with this. So I'll tell you what our services were like pre-COVID, during COVID, and since we've gone back in person, to give you some ideas of what we have done, what has worked. I'll be honest about what hasn't worked as well. And then I think it would be good to actually get some of you off mute so that you can ask questions and make it more of a conversation rather than just lecturing to you, because that was not the plan. So before COVID, when we started, we had everyone was in together, and we would have some sung worship to begin with, and then we would have what we would call our listening time. So we would have Bible story and talk, and then prayers, and then some more sung worship, and then end. Now, that general structure is how it has stayed, but how we do things has changed somewhat over the years. So when we first started, we tended to, when the talk was happening, there would be, oh, and if any children want to do an activity while they're listening, then you can go to the back with Alison and she will have an activity for you. And I would be there trying to talk to all of these children quite quietly, and trying to pick up on what was being said from the front, and then helping guide them through something that was like potentially a craft, potentially building something with Lego, whatever it was. The problem with that, well, there was a few problems with that. One was they were loud. And so people couldn't necessarily hear. And there is nothing wrong with hearing noise from children in church. I absolutely do not have that as an issue. But from a practical point of view, if you want to be able to hear a speaker and there is essentially a kids group going on in the same room, then it's not very practical. And that was the point when we realized that actually we were being more multi-generational than intergenerational. It was like there was something for the kids to do while the adults still had their adult talk. And when we heard Dave Senos speak, he threw out this challenge of, if you think that you're being intergenerational, are your generations actually interacting, or are they just occupying the same space? And I thought, wow, to be honest, we're just occupying the same space. That's not intergenerational at all. What did work, and did work really well, so if I get asked for, is there an off-the-shelf resource that I can use to create Intergenerational Church in an instant that is going to be easy to use? And the answer is yes, there is, and it's called Explore Together. So Scripture Union have got a book that is called Explore Together. And so we tried doing that once a month. Now, to be honest, I never led the exact session that was in the book. I looked at how the sessions were set out and their structure, and I used that structure for whatever our teaching scheme was on at that point in time. It's very easy to use in that way. So essentially you have a very short talk, introduction more, really short, that introduces a theme, and you have some questions that are set. So maybe 3 questions, and then you have different zones that correspond to different learning styles or ways of engaging, because people like to engage with God in different ways, don't they? And then you all come back together, and then you have some time of feeding back, and what you have learnt in your different zones. Now, that did work really well. I think the reason that it worked really well is because it was no longer very front-led, and people were able to explore at their, like, where they were at. So we do have a number of people attending church who are totally unchurched before they came to us. And Intergenerational Church is absolutely fantastic for these families, because so if I'm going to teach children how to find a passage in the Bible, a number of our adults need to learn that too. They don't know how to handle a Bible. They've got no idea how to do that. And it's very non-threatening if you go into a church that naturally is going to explain, this is how we find a passage. So this is how we find the book. The big number means this, the little number means that, and this is how we find it. And so that sort of thing where you can have this like alongside experience with children is really helpful for adults who are unchurched, because they've not got the previous experience that churched adults have got. And it's just very non-threatening. So yes, I heartily recommend Explore Together if you do want a resource and you think that you just want to try something and run with it and see how it goes. But if you look at the books, hardly any of them ever tell you how, from a practical point of view, how do you do intergenerational church? And I found that really frustrating, because if somebody tells me, do this, it will work, then I'm like, oh, I know what I'm doing now. I will do that thing and it will work. And it's easy to learn, isn't it? If somebody tells you the formula, then you can follow it, and that's easy. And just like, so I find, for example, leading a liturgical service is relatively easy. You have a book that tells you what to say. And so obviously doing it well, there is a lot of skill to that, but there is no book that tells you how to do intergenerational church in a practical way. And then I realized why. So having gone to a number of different conferences now and read a lot of books, the thing with intergenerational church is that it is context based always. We talk a lot in intergenerational church about intergeneration, I can't even say it now, intergenerationality. Anyway, we're going to talk about being relational. So it is not just something that is front led, and the person who is at the front of church has all the knowledge and all the power, and the people who are sat in the pews, chairs, whatever you have, are like empty vessels who are going to be filled and are going to come away with knowledge. It's not that sort of model of learning at all. I like it because I don't think that faith is cognitive. I don't think that it's something that goes on in our brain and is learning based. I think it's something that is, well, I mean, we all know it is spiritual. There is experience in there. There is some head knowledge, yes, but it's more than that. Faith is not just knowing a Bible story, is it? It's knowing God in your life, and things like, you know, learning how to pray, for example. And so when you start looking at building up relationships in church between the generations, then that is where you really get the benefit of intergenerational church. So my children, yesterday, they got all excited because we were running something called Film Club, Family Film Club, and one of the older gentlemen from St Andrew's Church was going to be there helping in the kitchen. And they were super excited that he was going to be there. I think honestly, James was excited because he knew that it meant that he'd get chocolate coins. But my older girls were really excited because they knew that he would talk to them. You know, he's in his 70s, but he talks to them like they matter, like he's interested, and he has time for them. And that sort of relationship is exactly what we're trying to cultivate in an intergenerational setting. So we value everybody, whether they have been like, whether they are my husband, the vicar, whether they've walked in for the first time and they don't even know what they've walked into, whether they are a babe in arms. We've got someone who's in their 90s who comes along. We value everyone. And so COVID hit and changed church for us. And so we'd been doing really well with Explore Together, and that model of learning together was going brilliantly. And everyone was able to contribute. So when we took feedback at the end, then it didn't matter whether it was my now 3-year-old wanting to show a scribbled picture, or someone who had read something and felt really enlightened and wanted to share that. Everybody's voice mattered, and we all learned together, and that was brilliant. But when COVID hit, we couldn't be going off into 8 different spaces online to learn in all of the different ways. But what did happen at that point was that we asked all sorts of different people, would you contribute this to the service? So it might be prayers, it might have been the reading. Often actually what our church really enjoyed was taking a photo of something that they'd been asked to do, and that meant that they could contribute in all sorts of different ways. So for example, I think on Easter Sunday they'd been asked to create a cross out of anything that they wanted, anything at all, and to take a photo of it, and then we put them into iMovie and had a song in the background, so that was like a song that we could reflect on. And it was lovely because we had Duplo cross, we had a cross made out of wrenches that had been attached to someone's Land Rover, we had ones made out of flowers. There was honestly anything and everything went, but it showed the personality of everyone who was there, and it was a lovely way of people being able to contribute. But we also at that point were more intentional. It was a lot easier for us with our own children to get them to help us to lead. So our children, being clergy kids, were quite keen on this. They've seen mum and dad at the front of church a lot, and they're quite happy to have a microphone put in front of them. Thank you very much. Now, I know that that is not everybody's wish, and there honestly were not other children who wanted to do that in that way. But I've come to the conclusion, my kids count too. I'm allowed to develop them and help them. And so because we were on camera then, and we pre-recorded, so they were quite happy because it meant that they could re-record if they'd gone wrong in their eyes. We didn't always edit, I have to say. There were times when we said, no, imperfect is just perfect, and we're going to crack on, and that is okay. And there's meltdowns on camera and everything that have gone out over the course of COVID. But what that did mean was that there were times when they helped us in all different parts of the service. And because we still knew, well, we knew that we still had children watching, then that meant that we had to think about how we were engaging with families. Now, we didn't always get it right. I have to say it's quite difficult. In some ways, I think Zoom might have been easier because there is that interaction, but we decided not to do Zoom on purpose because so we first tried Facebook, and we found that a lot of people were viewing who would never normally set foot in church. So we decided to stick with that so that people in our community could get to know us better and they would know what we were like, because we were still very young church when COVID hit. So all sorts have happened. We have tried to be as interactive as we can during COVID and been busy in chat and trying to make sure that children have their voice going into chat as well. On Facebook, asking parents to make sure that they comment for their children. So we ask questions, even if it's just, what would you like us to pray for this week? But we have we haven't come to the end of COVID. We know that we haven't come to the end of COVID, but we are back in our church. So we went back on Palm Sunday. So we've been back in church for a while now. And we've had to be very creative in how we do church, because the difficulty with intergenerational church with COVID is that the whole point of building relationships and being able to interact with other people is that that's not what you're meant to do with COVID around. You're meant to be all very separate, aren't you? But well, let's just say we were creative. So how have we done that so far? Well, we still start with some worship, and we are looking forward to singing on Sunday, it has to be said, woo. But we have got, so we have, when you come into church at the moment, if you are a child or a teen, then you automatically get given a pack. If you are an adult, then you can pick up any of the things that are laid out if you feel like, oh, I quite like the look of that thing. Now, what's in these packs that they get? What do we have? So we have some fidget toys. There's very cheap fidget toys. We have a small pot of Play-Doh that either they can just use. Our teens love it as a fidget itself. They love the Play-Doh. And our toddlers, obviously, it's Play-Doh, who doesn't like it, but sometimes we use that within our service. And then they have snacks, individual snacks and sweets, because we're lovely. And they have so a number of our teen girls like adult colouring. So they get, so we have adult colouring sheets available, and if there isn't one available that goes with what we're talking about that week, then we make one up. We've got frames that we can drop the words into, and then depending on a child's age and stage of development, there's various different sheets that have got a visual depiction of what we're talking about that day. And they have, the younger children have a book. So in the front of the book, there is a welcome sheet that essentially is more for the parents and carers to say, look, your child is welcome. We're not worried about them making noise. And there's fiddle toys and snacks and different things here that your child may or may not want to use. Use them as it suits you. But what we put within the book, there's suggestions of things that you could either possibly talk to your child about. And we say, like, if you want to talk to your child in the pews to help them understand what we're talking about from the front, then you may want to talk about this. We also have Chat and Catch. So Parenting for Faith have got a wonderful sheet that you can print out that's got all sorts of different chat and catch ideas. There's also one for babies, which is really aimed at the parents, but so we give them out as well to help people think about prayer with their child. And we're very we're just very open to whatever you and your child are needing to do in your little family space, then that's fine, you do that. We give them ribbons and shaky eggs for worship, and there's no reason why, so we offer them to, like, honestly, I'm probably the only adult who goes for it, but they're available for adults as well as fidget toys. We have spares of everything, because there is absolutely no reason why an adult wouldn't need a fidget toy. But equally, we know that some adults do not want to have one thrust at them, so that's why we say, look, if you want, take. If not, then it's fine. If that's not where you're at, that's not where you're at, and that's okay. And then in the pews, every pew has a whiteboard and some pens. So we like to be very interactive. And interaction is key, because we don't want to just have someone who stood at the front. We want to empower the people who are on their own discipleship journey to own their faith from the very beginning of coming in, so that they know what they think or know what they're questioning, rather than us telling them, you should think in this particular way. It's all very well and good telling someone, I believe this, but if that's not what they believe, if they're not there yet, then it's not necessarily helpful. So we do quite a lot of asking questions. And that's where the whiteboards come in. Because we weren't allowed to share microphones previously, we would maybe have asked a question and then run around with a microphone to see who wants to say something. Now, we couldn't do that because of COVID and sharing a microphone. You weren't allowed to do that. So we got these whiteboards. So now when we ask questions, we say, can you write or draw? And it will be anything in the talk, or often in the prayers, will be like any prayer requests, maybe on the theme, maybe not. And then we ask people to hold them up. And then what we do for the people who are at home, because we're still streaming on Facebook, is we also say that if you're at home, then would you type in the chat? And it's exactly the same question. There's a little bit of lag with Facebook, so we go around the church first and look at the whiteboards, and then by the time we've done that, then people have had a chance to catch up and for things to pop up in our Facebook feed. And then we use what people have said for either the talk or the prayers. So rather than it being a totally, I cannot necessarily write a talk now. I tend to have a lot of notes, and sometimes I'll have like quite a lot of research, maybe lots of statistics that might help, or some good Bible, lots of different Bible verses, so that I can pull things together to try and include what people have been saying from the pews, because it's really important. And there is a little bit of interaction that goes on between, because people can see what other people have held up. And you can also do things like pass messages between pews, because you can write and turn, and like people can read and can do it that way. And we ask people to do things like to maybe look, and if we're going to do prayers, then maybe it would be something like, can you see someone in the church or in the chat who is of a different generation to yours who you could pray for? Just as a very quick, for example. And at the moment, it seems to be going very well. It's a lot calmer, I have to say, than when we had children all bundling to the back, which wasn't intergenerational anyway. It is going to change again. I know that as we are, it will come to a point. At the moment, we're staying sat in our family groupings. We live in, I think, the worst place in the whole of the UK for COVID at the moment. So we are keeping masks and sitting in our family groupings for a while longer. But some of that will come to an end, and I am looking forward to when that comes to an end, because I'm really looking forward to the point when we can maybe do Explore Together again, or when there can be more conversations going on between each other in the service. What has started to happen in the last couple of weeks is we've encouraged people, when the limit to gatherings outdoors went up to 30, we encouraged people to have a chat outside the building and to stay for some fellowship. And we noticed at that point that the intergenerational relationships weren't lost. So the ones that already existed pre-COVID, they were still there, and the adults and children were talking to each other very much on a level basis, not oh, I'm talking down to a child type situation. It was genuine interest in each other's lives. So that is still there. So I'm pleased about that, because I think that when we get that interaction going more within the church, then that's still going to be there. Anyway, I've talked for long enough. I feel like I've said a lot and then not a lot at all, but I wonder whether if I remove my spotlight, if any of you have got questions. And you're like, no, don't make me talk, Alison. Sarah, hi.
Hey, hello. What was the book that you held up a while ago? There we go.
That one. So,
yeah, let me just make a note of it.
I have got a few books here. I would recommend, if you want a book that is going to go through a lot of the benefits, a lot of the basics, then I would suggest, if you're going to read one book, read this one. It goes through, so it's got the theology in there as well, which I think is really helpful, particularly if you're talking to the vicar, if you're not the vicar. And if you can give a theological basis for intergenerational church, then I think that that's a great place to start.
Yeah, that's really great. Thank you.
And I particularly like this one. It's not the newest one, but I like it because I find it just, I don't know, it's laid out in a way that I find a bit more practical, and I find it easier to think about my church when looking at that book. So then the next one in the series, you may already have seen, is called
I've got that one.
I think quite a few people have this one. Honestly, I do like it, but I don't find it as helpful as the Intergenerational Christian Formation one when it comes to thinking about my own context. It's got all sorts of little nuggets that are really helpful to get you thinking, and you might sit there thinking, oh, that's brilliant, but applying it I didn't find as easy. And then the latest one, so these are all from the Intergenerate conference. It's the book that comes out. So this is the latest one that I have got. You've got yours as well, Jules. Yes. So I got mine via Amazon.com. I don't know whether it's gone on to Co-UK yet.
I think it's just gone on. I know, I think I pre-ordered it from the conference. So I think.
Who's it by? It's really hard to see.
Oh, sorry. It's Corey Seibel.
I got mine from Eden, and it came literally the next day. I got it yesterday.
Because I'm Facebook friends with the chap who's edited it, I've known that it's been coming for a long time, and I've been waiting for it to come out because I thought it would have some brilliant bits in so I'm studying for a master's at the moment, and I thought that it would have some brilliant bits in to quote for my last assignment that I did. Unfortunately, it didn't come out in time, but because I've known it's coming, as soon as it did come out in America, I ordered it. I've been waiting for it because it's so it's called Engage All Generations, but then it has underneath, it says a strategic toolkit for creating intergenerational faith communities. And I was like, honestly, that's what I need in my life. I need something that is more practical, that's going to help me think through some of how we do things. So they've got some really practical things in there about change. I think that there are a number of churches at the moment that, because COVID hit and they've had a natural break, And now people are starting to hear about intergenerational church more and hearing about the benefits and starting to wonder about it. It feels like a natural break point at which to start introducing an intergenerational service. Or I know some churches feel very strongly that they could just introduce intergenerational elements. I think there is worth in that, absolutely, because anything that is going to support the relationships between the generations, we know from the sticky faith research that that is important. And I think that anything that we can do, so for example, we've got from September, I'm going to be running a little intergenerational project that also is trying to support it's a growing faith initiative. So we're going to be trying to have the children from our local C of E school are going to become pen pals for some of our congregation, and we're going to be looking at doing some guided letters throughout the year, going back and forth. And what we're really hoping is that the younger ones are going to start now, so that by the time they leave in year 6, they will have quite a long-held, quite long-standing relationship with the person who they're talking to, but also to hi Sarah, break down some of the barrier between school, home and church. So yeah, we've got things like that going on.
I'd love to hear more about that when it's up and running and how it goes. We launched a intergenerational new worshipping community in a church school in September 2019, and so a lot of what you've described is kind of the journey we've been on with it, but looking at those links between school and church would be really interesting. I love the sound of that letter, and kind of, you know, the kind of ongoing connections between generations through letter writing. I love that idea, so I'd love to hear about it.
Yeah, well, you've got all sorts of bits of safety in there as well, because that would be the interesting bit, particularly because
that's the thing that is slowing me down, if I'm honest, in terms of so safeguarding. One thing I do get asked about quite a lot in terms of intergenerational church is safeguarding. So for that particular thing, that particular project, one of our main safeguards is that it is letterbox contact. So it comes through me. I know that one of the things I need to be really hot about is looking out for any sort of grooming. I need to make sure that there aren't relationships that are inappropriate forming. What our plan is for the class rather than individuals to write. So it may be that there are certain individuals who actually pen the letter, but that it is from the class. And then we're going to also, so there'll be guidelines for both school and for the people at home about what is and isn't appropriate. We're also going to be, we're trying to talk to the school about how much is appropriate for a child to reveal that could be quite identifying information. Because obviously over a period of time you can build quite a picture of a child through a lot of letters, and so we need to make sure that there is, for example, no one child who has a lot of little bits of information that is going to build up over time. So yes, basically yes, there is a lot of safeguarding that has to go on. What I would say though is that we do get challenge about safeguarding quite a lot. I think we do need to remember sometimes that it is a very normal thing to have a relationship with anybody else in church. It doesn't necessarily have to be between old and young. It is normal to have friends in church. And just like it is normal to have someone come and babysit your children and you might go out for an evening. Now, I know that doesn't feel normal at the moment, but that's sort of, yeah, I'm thinking, please, come on, someone at some point post-COVID. But that sort of thing, you know, we are talking about normal things here. So we have to be really careful when we're thinking about safeguarding, is that we don't always jump to the worst case scenario. However, we need to always be really clear about boundaries. We need to be really hot on looking out for anything that is inappropriate. There's also times when it has to be said, though, that certain things are outside of my hands. So while you're in the church building, then yes, I can see everything that's going on. If you decide to have a meal with someone else from the church in your home, now I'm all for that. I think that's brilliant. We do that all the time. But then safeguarding is something that you need to be thinking about. Obviously, if there was ever someone coming along who we had been informed that there were issues, then Sunday gathering would not be the appropriate place for them to be. But that would be discussion with our diocesan safeguarding advisor.
Alison, it's been really helpful. I'm interested in, I've got a similar sort of situation. I've got a, so our main church is a sort of traditional middle of the road, organ, communion, choir, and we get very few children, except when they're trying to get to church school and then they disappear.
Yeah.
We tried a fresh expressions. We don't have a church hall. We tried a fresh expression in the church school pre-COVID, and it never grew beyond a sort of dedicated about the 4 people that started it plus about 2 families, and it never gained sort of critical mass. And we're thinking of trying to, we've got another church, another small church that doesn't get used a lot. We're thinking about trying to do something intergenerational every week. I'm interested in the type of music, because obviously we've got traditional organ music in our normal church. When we did our fresh expression, we tried, so we used YouTube videos, and it was sort of pitching it, because do you have some action songs for the children and some more adult worship songs? Do you make it, do you try and pitch it?
A really good question. The first thing I would say is that Intergenerational Church is not only for a contemporary service. Intergenerational Church works incredibly well in a traditional service, and for years that is what, particularly in rural communities that are small, that is what they have done, and they've done it really well, and they just didn't know that the name for it was Intergenerational Church. I think it's more about how you interact with and engage with everybody who's there. And one of the things when it comes to a more liturgical or traditional service is that it is a very alien environment if you've never been there before.
Which is why we're thinking to try and get more families in if we make it more contemporary, to make it less alien.
I think you have 2 options. One is, yes, you could do something more contemporary, which makes it less alien. The other thing is that you become very skilled at explaining what is happening. And there's different ways of doing that. It could be from the front. So I have been to a lot of church services over the years, and there are certain people, I'm thinking now, when my husband was on at his major church placement, when he was training to be a vicar, there was one particular reader who is honestly the best person I have ever known at leading you through a liturgical service so that if you had never been before, you would know exactly what you were doing, because he always would explain well, but not in a way that it wasn't intrusive. It wouldn't make you feel like, why on earth are you saying that if you'd been there all of these years? He just naturally remembered to tell you things like the page number you were on, or if you needed to go to the blue book, it's the blue book on this page that we're going now, and it's be halfway down the page, or we're going to sing a song now, so please stand. It's the sorts of things that we forget, the cues that we forget to give, because we have got such a long-standing congregation who know what they're doing, that is why it is difficult if you walk in, because nobody is telling you what to do. But like, if somebody who was new walked in, well, if someone, okay, it's a bit tricky because of COVID at the moment, but what if somebody sat with them and was like, oh, we're on this bit now, or oh, you're going to need this booklet now, because often you have 2 or 3 books, don't you, on the go, or and so how we help people. The other thing is, for example, I've seen brilliant bags that have got play materials for different liturgical seasons, or for example, if it's Holy Communion, well, letting them play through Holy Communion in the pew. Absolutely valid thing to do for them, for a child to be within the service and to be learning the way of the community through play. Then that is a perfect way of doing that. But where the intergenerationality comes in is going to be making sure that they are included. So, for example, one of my children is 6, and he is at the very early stages of learning to read. He has some learning difficulties, so there is no point in putting a whole load of words in front of him, but putting some pictures in front of him, that includes him, and it can guide him through. We can guide through with visuals. Obviously that takes more thought than just having your standard service sheet, but to be honest, Intergenerational Church takes more thought. It is not something that you can just bang out in a very standard set way, week in, week out. If you're going to be including a lot of different people, it does take more thought. So I would say I wouldn't necessarily jump to contemporary, but what have we done was the question. So we were very blessed in that we had a worship band. So the 2 families who did come and joined us from the very beginning had musical people in both families, and so they could form a band. I don't think they did on the very first week. To begin with, we kind of like had some and some of, so you can get the worship lyric videos, which we pay for, so that they're covered under license. And so they go up and we can use them, or there is the band. So the band have not been back in since COVID. Partly it's just the practicality of, if you're not in a massive building, if you're having to have at least 2 meter spacing between band members from different families, there simply wasn't the space in which to do that. So we've had the lyric videos. We do have action songs. I have to say that some of the children do not join in with the action songs. Almost all the adults do, though. They love a good action song. And
I have a 90-year-old who used to absolutely love the action song. She was
yeah. And it is part of our culture in Sunday gathering that we have action songs. It's been from the very beginning. We do that partly because some of us, we like to worship with our bodies, but we don't always know how. So an action song can be really helpful, not just for children, but for adults too. Now, I was queen of the action song. I would always get up. It would be like, Alison's going to come and lead us now. I am no longer queen of the action song. My two biggest girls, who are 14 and 12, they are our action team. They get up and they do them every week. I was not very well while we were filming for a while. I had a neck brace on, and so I did not do the action song every week when we were filming, but my big girls carried on. And then I realized that they were doing a better job than me. And that is really important in Intergenerational Church. For someone who is quite a strong leader to realise that there are people in the congregation who can do a better job than you, and you need to get out the way and let them do it. And so that's what we did there. So they now do that. Now, there is no reason going forwards that other people couldn't, and we did try and encourage other people to join in if they wanted to be at the front. We tend to find people are less keen to be at the front leading something, but are quite happy to join in. But my 14-year-old, who is on the action team, so she preached for the first time on Sunday. And she preached at St Andrews and then came and preached at St Anne's as well. So it was quite interesting for her to find what it was like to preach on the same theme, but in two very different settings, and how that felt, and what it was like doing that. And she did say that she found Sunday gathering was a lot harder. And I said, yeah, I get that. It is harder to preach intergenerationally than it is to stand up in a pulpit and talk. But she did it, and she's 14, and she had something to say. So it was important that we let her say it, and we would do the same for anyone. Oh, I'm sorry, people are having to head off. It is getting late, isn't it?
And you've given us lots to think about.
I'm quite happy to answer more questions, but if you are all feeling like you're tired now.
I've got one more question about the talk, actually, because you mentioned, you said that you sort of got lots of stats and things together. So how does that work? You read the Bible passage and then you ask people questions, and then that feeds into the talk?
So it depends on what we're doing. So that does change each week. And I have to say, I am a little bit conscious that can be difficult for some of our autistic congregation, that does change each week. So we need to be really careful about how we guide people through. We don't always read the Bible. It's not unusual for us to have visuals. So, for example, Saddleback Kids, they made some of their videos free, other ones you can pay for, and use them. They are excellent quality, and we like them because they stick to the Bible well.
Very much so, yeah.
Yeah. The other thing that we've used quite a lot is the Bible Project. So my little boy, who I've mentioned, who is 6, who has learning difficulties, he actually sits and watches Bible Project videos. And I didn't realise until recently how much he was getting from them, because sometimes he doesn't look like he is paying as much attention.
Oh, I've got one of those.
But you know what, there is a lot going in. I think that's the other thing that's worth saying is So I've got a 3-year-old boy at the moment. He's literally just 3. He is a nightmare in church. So when everybody else stays in their family space, he does not. He is the one who is going to make everybody else feel so much better about their kids when they turn up. He has a ministry all of his own in that way. And he'll be up, down, he'll be trying to get in the pulpit or behind the altar or wherever he can. He'll want to be climbing on everything. So at the moment, church for him, do I feel like it would be easier to send him out to a group that was designed for a 3-year-old? Yes. But from a mother, yes, it would be easier to send him out. Do I think it would be the best thing for him? No. No, I don't. I think that what church is for him at the moment is like, actually, if what we're working on this week is we're going to worship God for 5 minutes. He's 3. If he joins in with 5 minutes of worship songs, that's good. That's fine if that's what we're working on. If he decides that he wants to engage with a craft this week, and I get a few minutes of talking to him about what the craft is about, then that's good. Expecting a 3-year-old to sit there throughout an entire church service and take in everything and interact in everything, that's not going to happen. That's not how 3-year-olds are built, and that's not what we expect. But what we don't do is shove them out. We don't shove them out because inevitably there's that point of having to learn. So we in each of the pews where there are children, there's either Lego if they're old enough, or Duplo, or Mega Blocks, or maybe there's cars on a car mat. So some of our families who are very regular, we know what their kids really love playing with. And we do have a number of children who've got additional needs. We've got a number who are on the spectrum. So I know there's certain trays, if I know I've got to get the right tray of Lego to the right family because they will remember the pieces that they had last week, and that's okay. That is how we, so one of my children's on the spectrum. So we roll with that, and we know that that's important, and we make sure that that happens. And so, but what we find is you'll think that they're just playing Lego, and then they'll come and be like, I made Jesus, or like, this is the stable, or not even show you something out of Lego, but they'll tell you something at another point in the week, and you think, oh, I thought you were just playing with Lego. But actually, while they were playing, they were listening. So it might look like they're not interacting, but they are. And they're learning the way of the community by being immersed in the community and learning things like, oh, and now we're going to pray, and what that might look like. Now, prayer in our church looks at all sorts of different ways because we have all sorts of different interactive ways of praying, and that does change quite a lot as well. But again, they're learning that prayer can look very different. It's not always right, hands together, eyes closed. But they're learning the culture. Another thing that we did pre-COVID, so on second Sunday when we had Explore Together, it was also our Celebration Sunday. Celebration Sunday was really important to the community. So the things that we did in Celebration Sunday was, at the beginning, we would, so after we had a couple of worship songs, then we would say, all right, is there anything that we're celebrating? So we'd have someone's passed their music exam, someone's had their wedding anniversary, someone's got 10 out of 10 on their French test, or they've gone to big school, or like moved house, whatever it was. It could be big, small, whatever was going on that they wanted to celebrate. And we do celebrations first, and we thank God for all of those things and pray for them. And then we do birthday. So I'd ice individual cakes and put a candle in. And then if basically, if you wanted a cake, you had to come to the front and then and be sung to, and that was how you earned your cake. And so because people wanted cake, they did. So then we knew whose people's birthdays were on that month, and we'd celebrate them. And we learned very quickly, you only ask the children how old they are. But then after the service, we had a meal. So we started off by doing bring and share. And then we learned that bring and share in a community that is quite deprived isn't necessarily the way to do it, because people feel self-conscious about what they might be able to bring. So we then went to a more catered thing. So jacket potatoes was quite common, or just like trays and trays of sandwiches and things like, you know, it wasn't difficult to do, but a few of us would cater, and then we would have a family meal. And eating together was it's really key. It's something that we see Jesus do a lot in the Bible, and it does change ministry.
It makes it very easy intergenerationally, doesn't it, when you're eating?
And that was the point, because then the conversations go beyond the just very short ones that you might have, because people relax when they're eating, and they do have quite different conversations, and you go a bit deeper and you find a bit more out about different people's situations, what's going on in their lives, and yeah, those relationships would form, and it was brilliant. And we're looking forward to
we did something similar to that, in that we had a good news slot once a month, and that works really well. I once had a lady ask me, well, what's the point? I don't really want to know if they've got their swimming badge. But when I sort of said it so that we get to know each other, and find out what's going on in our lives, and it builds us up as a body, they got that, but they needed that explaining why we were. Otherwise, it was just like, oh well, you know, because the children would always have something, and the same children would always have something.
Yeah. But you know what? I think so. When you've got the same children who have something, who are keen to talk into a microphone, then I'm starting to think, right, you're comfortable talking into a microphone. Do you have giftings of leadership here? Is there something that we need to be thinking about? Because you clearly feel that you can talk to a group of people, and there's not a lot of children who feel super comfortable with that. And so we need to explore that a bit more and work with that child and see what else they might be willing to do. And we try really hard to not necessarily make it reading. A number of our children, their reading ability isn't at a stage where they could do the reading, which is obviously a nice job that you can give someone that is very easy to give, isn't it? Like, this is the reading I've given, like you can even print out the words, read it, and I'll tell you when to come up, and you've done your bit. Like, it's quite an easy task to give to someone without too much prep. But there are kids who are very competent with a microphone but not going to be able to read. So yeah, that's what I'd be thinking in that situation.
Much scarier to give them the microphone to pray.
So I do, yes, but we do.
Oh,
I
absolutely.
have one of my children. He has to tell me what he says he wants to say before he gets the microphone. I do vet him. And I know that might sound a bit off, but all sorts could come out otherwise, and we don't necessarily. So, and like, you know, we can do that to everybody. You might have adults that you need to do that to. Sometimes it's a good thing to do. But the beauty of the whiteboards, I don't know if our whiteboards are going, you know, because one, not everyone wants to talk into a microphone, and two, you get a moment to read what they've said and think about how you phrase it to everybody else if it's a
little challenging.
Yes, if it's like, how, you know, sometimes you need to think about the situation that someone's in, and how you bring that to the rest of the congregation. And you do get a second or two in which to do that when you have it written on a whiteboard. But you get very good at thinking on your feet with Intergenerational Church, because anything can happen. Jules?
So, Alison, do you always end up sharing everything that people, it's all kind of from the front in a way, isn't it, what you're saying? Because I was imagining more like conversations between people doesn't necessarily always get sort of shown or shared, if you know what I mean. So I'm just interested to see the different models in a way.
So at the moment, because we're sat in family groupings apart, then it is very filtered through the front.
Yeah, okay.
In a way that I don't like, and I would say is less intergenerational. What we do though is encourage people to carry on the conversation, to think about what the people have said outside. The ideal, so what we would have done before is, can you turn to the person in the pew behind you and talk about this? And it doesn't necessarily even then get fed back. It doesn't necessarily get shared. And sometimes that's quite important as well. There's things when we have to make sure that we're not asking people to share, because it's sensitive and it's not the sort of thing everyone's going to want to share. Also, it can be introverts. They just sit there and never want to come again.
Do people also sort of practice more like spiritual gifts on each other, you know, like prophecy and healing and that kind of thing in your context? Or
pre-COVID, yes. Through a TV screen is a lot harder, so very much during, no, not so much, although we do so I've been quite open about my own health, and so when it comes to prayer requests, then I will say I'd really appreciate it if you would pray, because I've got my appointment with a neurosurgeon tomorrow. And then they might come up the next week in chat, or they might come and ask me, how did it go? And I know, so we have people who are in the southwest who join us, who have been praying for my healing, who have only been able to join since COVID because of going out over Facebook. So in that way, yes, that sort of thing does go on, and it's been fabulous, because I'm now off the hook for a year with a neurosurgeon. But but in a very practical, hands-on way, no, it will come back. And yes, and there is and we wouldn't limit praying. So praying for each other was very common before, a common practice, like within the pews before COVID hit, and we are desperately hoping that it happens again.
That's part of my question actually as well, Jules, that something as a church we're not very good at. Well, some people will come and get prayed for, but not everybody. And I think by taking it out of that, almost out of the front's hands, although it's very deliberately not just the leadership team that are praying for folk, building up a team, but releasing, particularly releasing children, because when children pray, God answers, because they just expect him to. And he gives them words and he gives them pictures, and but how to do that in a church that isn't really ready for that.
So I think so there are some really good things about culture change that you probably want to be looking into before trying to launch too much into it, because that is quite a big culture change. And honestly, we didn't manage things as well as we could have done when we planted, because we hadn't intended to be intergenerational. And I think if we had, then we could have been very clear from the start, and everybody would have known what they were joining. But we did at least have the benefit of being able to set culture from a blank slate. So things like eating together was normal from the very beginning. So for a lot of churches who've never done that, it might feel very alien. What we did do before we ate together the first time, and so what we often do when there's something that we know is really key to culture and we want to make sure that people understand why we're doing something, is that we teach on it. So for example, before we had our first family meal together, we talked about the importance of eating together and looked at Jesus eating with people and talked about why that was important and why we were doing it before we then practiced it. And we've done that with quite a number of different practices. So for example, doing teaching about prayer has been another, like we've very purposefully gone through a series on teaching about prayer, and I think that does help. I think the other thing that is quite difficult when we start going through this sort of change, particularly as people who are at the front of church, who are in charge, is that you lose a lot of control. And I think some people are a bit concerned about feeling out of control. And there's a lot of what ifs about, like, what if dangerous theology is occurring in the pews? What if somebody gets totally the wrong end of the stick when they're reading something? What if someone prays and then something doesn't happen? Like, how damaging is that going to be? Like, how do I deal with that if I don't know that it's going on? And there's so many what ifs that come out because we're no longer in a very controlled environment.
I mean, God can actually do his stuff.
Well, that's exactly what I would say, is that you're not in control, but God is. And yes, it can be messy. It can be very messy. It doesn't always work in the way that you might have envisaged. But if we're going to take seriously that God can do more than we can ask or imagine, then we need to give him the reins and let him get on with it, surely. Right, I think it is probably a good time to go because it is 9 o'clock now.